Thank you, Sarah. And just to check, everything's displaying okay on your side?
Looks beautiful. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm really pleased to be able to speak to you today about this concept of complementarity and how we think it's a crucial part of increasing critical metals resilience. So hopefully in the next few minutes, I'll be able to sensibly explain what we mean by that and hopefully get you a little bit excited about the possibilities as well. And then, of course, you can see my job title there. I am going to touch on the PGMs. So that will certainly be coming in. But a lot of the content I'm outlining is essentially a potted summary of our critical metals white paper, which I will point you to if you want more in-depth analysis. So the standard disclaimer, let's just get that one out of the way. And on to the fairly serious context, of course, for the conversations we're having this week and today, which is, the Omni crisis facing us. The world is facing some pretty serious challenges, as we know. Climate change, the big one, the existential threat, but we're having to address that within a context of scarcity of a whole range of different resources. And then, of course, energy insecurity. Clearly, there's a geopolitical angle there, but that also speaks to this need for a just energy transition. We have to widen access to affordable energy and raise the standard of living for more of the world's population. So the bottom line there is we need to transition to net zero to protect people and the planet. But importantly, we need to transition to net zero in a way that protects people and the planet. And I think that's a really important nuance. And coming on the heels of that brilliant presentation from Saad, when we're talking about the environmental impact of nickel mining in Indonesia, when we're seeing serious consideration being given to seabed or deep sea mining, when we're talking about biodiversity impacts in the great ape habitats, for example, I think it is time to just stop and pause and just have a moment of reflection before we potentially pass through the looking glass. So we really do think that the concept of critical metals efficiency is overdue in the conversation on the energy transition. I think critical metals efficiency is a fairly self-evident concept, but I've been told it's not that obvious. So if you'll allow me, I'll explain it as a kind of corollary to energy efficiency. So clearly in the fossil fuel economy, the one we're moving away from, the one we largely still have today, the one we all grew up in, we have an intuitive grasp of the concept of energy efficiency because the energy itself, the fuel, relies on an extractive industry. It's a finite resource. And of course, it is polluting in its extraction, its processing, and crucially in its use. So therefore, we should use that energy efficiently, hence energy efficiency. But now we're moving towards more use of renewable energy. And there, by definition, now you're talking about the energy itself being, by definition, non-finite, non-polluting, and non-extractive. You don't have to mine the sun and wind. But of course, harnessing that energy in the form of electricity and making direct use of that electricity, particularly in the form of batteries, requires intense use of certain critical metals. And now we're looking at an extractive industry exploiting a finite resource with obviously potential, really significant potential for pollution. So therefore, clearly, we need this concept of critical metals efficiency. Now, allow me to emphasize, we are not saying that energy efficiency is unimportant. It remains important, but it is one dimension of what should be a much more rounded picture. Because, of course, here's the problem. We all know why we're having this discussion. It's just a case of too much too fast. So just to outline this is publicly available data from the International Energy Agency for its net zero emission scenario. So this is a Paris Agreement compliant path. And they project a rising requirement for cobalt, lithium, nickel, and copper in clean energy technologies. So quadrupling in the space of less than 20 years in this scenario. And then if you look at what's driving that in the chart on the right there, it's really quite interesting how the drivers break down because the energy supply side is a component here. So all those solar panels, those wind turbines, but that's not really the major driver for these metals. By far the largest driver is what you could call the energy demand side or the consumption side. So it's that electricity infrastructure to carry electricity to where it's needed, very copper intense. And then, of course, those batteries, particularly in electric vehicles, again, critical metals intense. So the challenge here is obviously there's a supply gap that needs to be bridged. So the question is not just can we bridge the supply gap, but how are we going to bridge that supply gap in a way that recognizes the need for wider environmental stewardship. But let's just assume we do this, we meet this challenge, we manage to close the supply gap and we do it in a relatively benign way. Is that it then? Have we kind of solved all the problems? Have we won the energy transition? And of course, no, because we are still then only looking at addressing a part of overall energy consumption. And to illustrate that, here's more data from the International Energy Agency, again for its net zero emissions scenario on the same time frame to 2040. And what I've done is I've taken the energy consumption data, and on the left, I've broken that down by the sector in which the energy is consumed. And then on the right, I've broken it down by the form in which the energy is consumed. So that's the carrier that takes the energy to the final consumer. And I'll just draw your attention to the sector charts for a moment on the left there. And what I really want to note is, of course, road transport being about 1/5, 20% of our total energy consumption, of which around half is passenger cars. So that 20% breaks down roughly half between passenger cars and commercial vehicles. So vans, buses, and trucks, less numerous, but intensive energy users. So here we have a sector that is really dominating the conversation on the energy transition and is really dominating the critical metals conversation and having a pretty disproportionate impact on that, I would say. And even if we do succeed in making every single car on the road a battery vehicle, which we're very far from, BEV penetration into the global passenger car fleet's under 5% today. So even if we do get that to 100%, we have only addressed 10% of our total energy consumption. The other 90%, it's looking for solutions, it's looking for metals. And then electricity, I mean, clearly electricity, the direct use of electricity is brilliant for energy efficiency, but we cannot expect electricity to do it all. So again, coincidentally, the electricity grid today carries around 1/5 of our total energy consumption. A monumental effort might expand that to over 40% by 2040, assuming no copper constraint. So clearly electricity cannot do it all. So there is a need for technologies to work alongside batteries and alongside direct electrification. That's a straightforward conclusion from the data. So what are we saying about complementarity then? I mean, it's sort of fairly obvious, but it's marrying three concepts together. So we do know that critical metals supply constraints of certain metals do risk delaying or potentially derailing the energy transition. We do also know, again, straightforward conclusion that we need those complementary technologies to work alongside batteries, to work alongside direct electrification. You put those two things together, clearly those complementary technologies cannot add further to the extraction burden we already face for critical metals. In other words, they have to be highly critical metals intense technologies. And that's really what we mean by complementarity. It's that coexistence of solutions. It's those technologies working alongside each other, but it's the fact that we need those complementary technologies that bring critical metals efficiency. So a couple of examples now of what that looks like on the ground, and I'm going to go straight in with one that is potentially a bit controversial, but really should not be, which is fuel cell vehicles. So we know battery vehicles are fantastic for energy efficiency. We know that's the argument in favor of their use. But if we look at the critical metals content of a typical powertrain for a medium passenger car, and we just compare different powertrains there. So you've got the internal combustion engine vehicle on the top, the fuel cell vehicle in the middle, and the battery vehicle at the bottom. So you can see that battery vehicles are not an efficient user of critical metals relative to a fuel cell vehicle as the alternative zero emissions vehicle. This is not a competition. It should not be a competition. There should be no either or here, because what we're saying is you really do want to deploy a sensible mix of fuel cell vehicles and battery vehicles. And in doing that, you get to optimize to the extent possible the balance between energy efficiency, very important, and critical metals efficiency, just as important. And there is a wider benefit to using hydrogen, which is that it lowers the overall copper intensity of the energy transition. And copper, I think, personally, is going to potentially prove to be one of the most problematic critical metals. So we do need to look at that copper intensity. That chart there at the top, that's from S&P. That's an assessment from them of the typical copper content of different vehicles, depending on the type of powertrain again. And again, I just draw your attention to that very long purple bar at the bottom, which is a heavy-duty battery vehicle, so a battery bus, a battery heavy-duty truck. You know, we're talking nearly 1/2 ton of copper in each of those vehicles. So, you know, that is a level of copper intensity that potentially is not sensible. So you do have, again, that need for coexisting solutions. And then, of course, you also get the synergistic benefits in the infrastructure, electricity distribution infrastructure, very copper intense. So if you have a complementary, a coexisting hydrogen infrastructure, again, that lowers your overall copper intensity relative to a situation where you're entirely reliant on the electricity infrastructure. And yes, of course, hydrogen pipelines need other materials like steel and certain polymers. They're not critical and can, in fact, be largely repurposed from existing infrastructure. So that's nice. Maybe I've made the case to you for fuel cell vehicles and for hydrogen, sensible use of those, but you're going to say, but hang on, fuel cell vehicles certainly rely on PGMs. Many of the other technologies within the hydrogen ecosystem also rely on PGMs. So doesn't that actually, if you're going to use these platinum group metals, you know, they're really scarce, isn't that not going to make the critical metals problem worse? And this is why I say, aha, no, because the future supply and demand balance for PGMs is a huge opportunity. And this is not coincidental. This arises directly from the fact of the energy transition, because the largest single market for platinum group metals today, by far, is catalytic converters that go on vehicles with an internal combustion engine. We all know that market is going to decline in future for reasons I won't go into. At the moment, we know that those supplies of PGMs from their existing established sources will continue, and therefore that decline on the demand side opens up the space for new applications, new technologies. And of course, that's exactly what fuel cell vehicles are. They're not competing demand for platinum, they're replacement demand. What are the advantages of that? Not only that are you not stressing supplies, but you're also taking advantage of mature supply chains, existing processing infrastructure, existing recycling capacity, which is globally well established and mature, particularly here in Europe and the UK. So we do think there is an argument to harness PGM-enabled technology sensibly within the mix of energy transition technologies to help increase overall critical metals resilience. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Just to point out, if you do want more information, there's lots of information on our website. The Critical Metals Efficiency White Paper is there right at the top, and lots of supporting information on platinum group metals as well. Thanks.
Marge, as always, a massive, massive thank you for such a fantastic presentation. Thank you so, so much for all of this. I've also just put into the chat a link to the conference which we ran all together last year. So if you want to know more about platinum group metals, etc., or you're still thinking, but hang on a second, I've just heard that hydrogen can be a solution here. Why isn't it coming to the fore with regards to energy strategies, etc.? Go and check out some of those talks at last year's session. So Marge, actually, to lean into that, why aren't people more on board with hydrogen as being a solution? Why are we still just really talking about things like electric vehicles?
Yeah, it's a good question. And my personal diagnosis, I think, you know, the energy efficiency consideration has been, it's important, but it's not the only or overriding consideration. So I think we need to rebalance our thinking around energy efficiency, because that's always the number one challenge to hydrogen. So that's the first thing. The second thing is airtime, right? I mean, the energy transition's hard. Policymakers, other stakeholders have a lot of things competing for their attention. You know, batteries are challenging for any number of reasons. That's taken up a lot of airtime, so it's quite difficult to squeeze other things into the debate. And then I think there's also a lot of sort of misperceptions potentially around PGMs, because I mean, if you look at earth abundance, just, from the geological perspective, you think, oh, well, there's no way there's enough of these really scarce and expensive metals. And that's something a perception we're working very hard to change.
And I mean, just in terms of the availability, I guess, of the PGMs. So, yep, they come out of the ground in actually quite a small number of places, I guess. But the thing that I really like about the PGMs is actually, in part, because we've had them in catalytic converters for so long now, we are really, really, really good at recycling them, which is not
Absolutely.
something that the world really understands. Why don't we understand that we're really good at recycling PGMs? Or the greater world, I should say.
Yeah, part of it is that we haven't done a good job in communicating some of the data, because a lot of our recycling is invisible. We call it the closed loop. It just goes round and round. People buy metal and they get to reuse it over and over again. And
Yeah.
that recycling is essentially invisible because it's netted off reported demand. It's not reported as supply. So part of it is the fact that, we've kept some of this so circular that in fact it's not visible to the outside world. And that's very much the case for iridium and ruthenium, by the way. So I think that's partly it. I think it's again just a case of education. So we're trying to do that. It's not to say that recycling these metals is easy. It's not. But is it routine? Yes, it is. It's routine.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, to that was something that I certainly blew my mind last year, was just that ability, or that, the ability to recycle the PGMs, the fact that it is just normal routine. We don't know about it actually because it is very commercially sensitive with regards to understanding how much is doing that. But if you want a case study of the circular economy in action, this is it right here. And because we've been doing it for so long, compared to, say, a lot of the other critical minerals, for example, and metals that are out there, we've never really had to dig lithium out of the ground before. So therefore, of course, we don't really know how to recycle it. Am I interpreting that correctly, Marge?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And I mean, of course, we had the benefit with PGMs that it was value driven. We kind of just got on with it. We've never had to be mandated to do this because it was market driven. The metals were valuable enough. Even when you've got tiny quantities sitting on catalytic converters, it's still enough to incentivize recycling. So yeah, I think you've put your finger on it there, Sarah. I mean, we've had to do it to retain that value for PGM users. And we're getting to a situation now, of course, where we have to do it for other critical metals.
Awesome. Thanks, Marge. I've got so excited with my questions that I've totally ignored the ones that are coming in the chat. Sorry to Aoife and Dave, etc., who have been typing questions into the chat. Perhaps, Marge, if you've got a moment, you'd be able to type some replies there.
Absolutely.
Everyone, please put your hands together for the wonderful Marge. Thank you very
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everyone.
much.